We're here in Central America to search for ancient technology in Nicaragua and Costa Rica. We've seen some amazing ancient technology in Egypt and further evidence of ancient technology in Peru and Bolivia. I then decided we needed to investigate the many mysteries of Central America and the possible evidence for advanced ancient technology in that region. Our first stop was the capital of Costa Rica, San Jose. It was in San Jose that I was very curious about the giant stone balls that have been found in the southwestern part of Costa Rica. Many of these balls are huge, bigger than a car, and they've been moved to certain parks that are in San Jose where people can view these megalithic stone balls. I was really curious as to how these stone balls were made. My experiences with Christopher Dunn showed me that the ancients had some kind of power tools and engineering capabilities, much like we have today. And in fact, the machining of these perfectly spherical stone balls is something that is so difficult, it could really only be done with power tools. Despite the fact that these megalithic stone balls are found throughout Costa Rica, the various museums and publications give no idea of what the purpose was of these balls or even how they were constructed. This granite ball here at the National Museum in San Jose, Costa Rica, is one of the better specimens. Perfectly round. It's quite a large ball. It probably weighs several tons, possibly even up to 10 tons. It's been carved out of a very hard granite and is an exquisite piece of megalithic architecture. But once again, the purpose of these balls and even how they were made remains a mystery to archaeologists. One of the theories on Atlantis is that Atlantis was around 10,000 BC, a worldwide civilization, a maritime civilization. They left their capital city of Atlantis and in the ships went all over the world, going to the Americas, to Africa, to Europe, and to all continents. It's one of the mysteries of Atlantis is these giant stone balls. These giant granite balls are often associated with the Atlanteans. They're found on many continents, especially here in Central America. But these giant stone balls have been found in Malta. They've been found on remote islands such as Easter Island. There's an area of New Zealand that also has round stone balls like this. Another big question with these giant stone balls is what they were for. It's baffling to archaeologists why anyone would go through a considerable effort, even if they had power tools, to make these giant stone balls. I mean, what is the point? Today, mainstream archaeologists are just grasping at straws for some kind of explanation. Their main explanation right now is that these giant stone balls, and some of them are relatively small, only the size of a basketball or a little bit bigger, while others are 5, 6 feet in diameter, that they're some kind of ceremonial object. And they have found some of the smaller stone balls in tombs in Costa Rica. And it's like important chiefs or kings or shamans were buried with these stone balls, generally the small ones. But still, it doesn't really explain what these stone balls were for. It's my theory that these stone balls that are found in the tombs and burials of some of these important people in ancient Costa Rica, that they didn't know what these balls were for either, and that these balls are many, many thousands of years old. They're apparently washed up like by some tidal wave that hit the southwest coast of Costa Rica, and it literally washed these balls up into mountain jungle areas, onto one of the islands that's off the coast of Costa Rica. The ancient people of Costa Rica, who are then using these balls as some kind of ceremonial object, didn't actually build them or machine these balls. They're finding them in the jungle, thinking they're some kind of, eggs of the gods or giant balls, stone balls of the gods. And then the small ones, just because they're some oddball important object, are buried with these chiefs. But they didn't make these balls. They were already there. So you have to ask yourself, who made these balls? And what was their function? This is something that we really haven't figured out. My idea is that these balls are from many thousands of years ago. The same people who were building at Tiwanaku and at Cuzco and Ollantaytambo and Machu Picchu and other megalithic areas of Peru and Bolivia were a similar people as to those in Central America, including perhaps the Olmecs, who are building the colossal basalt heads and other giant megalithic artifacts that we can find there. And they, with their machine tools, and I believe the Olmecs had machining tools, as were used in Egypt, as were used in Peru and Bolivia and other areas of the world. And it was through this that they were making these giant stone balls. We still don't know exactly what they're for. Theories say that they were possible use by navigators, and that by placing these stone balls in positions together, we're showing like where islands were for people who were crossing the Pacific or crossing the Atlantic in transoceanic trading expeditions and things like that. So that's one idea, that these huge stone balls were all part of a elaborate map system. Perhaps, too, they were showing where stars were and constellations. In my mind, that's a pretty interesting theory. However, I don't think it explains the really, really large stone balls very well, because they are so huge and so heavy, and it would have been so difficult to make those. It seems like it would have been a lot of extra effort that would be quite unnecessary if you're just trying to create star maps and navigation maps with islands and things. You wouldn't need giant stone balls for that, in my mind. Today, these balls from the swamps of southwestern Costa Rica are scattered around the country. They're found in bank lawns, in museums, and even in private homes. We're deep in the jungles of central Costa Rica, the lost city of Guayabá. This is a city that was unknown to the archaeological world until 25 years ago. One of the great mysteries of Central America, especially the area around Costa Rica and Nicaragua, is that we have very little evidence of organized city-states, of planned communities. And yet, here in the central jungles of Costa Rica, we find exactly that. We see this wide road. We see these well-built platforms on either side. Yet this amazing city was abandoned a few hundred years before the Spanish arrived. We don't know who the people were who built this city. We don't know where they went or why they abandoned this city. It's part of the mysteries of Costa Rica and Central America. One of the problems with the search for ancient technology here in Central America is, as you can see, we're in a very dense rainforest. This makes it extremely difficult to preserve man-made articles, especially metals or artifacts made out of wood. One of the other interesting things that we discovered in Costa Rica is their use of tattooing and stamps. And in fact, the various Indians in Costa Rica had all sorts of fancy textiles and body painting, as well as tattooing with charcoal and parts of their own blood. This was used, of course, in all the Pacific islands. It was also used in Southeast Asia and in Arabia and among the Egyptians. And here, in a 1529 book that was written by Gonzalo Fernandez de Oveda, they talk about the type of tattooing that they were doing in Costa Rica. And he says here, all the Indians of Nicoya, and especially the leaders and their women, have their arms painted in that black paint that is made with their own blood and with charcoal. cutting and drawing first with blades from the flint. One of the other unusual ancient technology mysteries that we uncovered in Central America can also be found in this book, Sweat of the Sun and the Tears of the Moon, a book about gold and silver, pre-Columbian art. Andre Emmerich was a Swiss Costa Rican who was fascinated by all of the gold and jewelry that was found in Costa Rica and Panama and Colombia, including the oddball gold airplanes and things. It's mainly about the gold work and jewelry from Colombia and Panama and from Costa Rica. And a curious thing is in this book. On page 94, they show a gold pendant found in Panama. It's thought to be several thousand years old, and it has a gem inlaid in it. It's about 4.5 inches long, and it appears to be a zoomorphic pendant of some kind of heavy machinery. If you look at it, it has what looks like a backhoe coming out of the back. It's got blades in the back. In the front, it has a skid plate and other things. It appears to be really a monster that was really some kind of heavy machinery. In ancient times, to have electricity, to have iron and other very strong metals, this would naturally lead to power tools, to heavy machinery, and ultimately, even in a sense, to flight. It's interesting, with this pendant being made out of gold and an unknown gem in the center of it, is that gold is indestructible. All the gold that exists from ancient times still exists today in the form of jewelry, in ingots, in coins of gold. Gold itself was very valuable to the ancients, and it can't be destroyed. It doesn't rust and oxidize like other metals. But there's a problem with gold. Gold is really too soft to work in machines and things. Gold can be used in electrical devices, but otherwise it's best used just as jewelry. You know, there's a lot that you don't know about the banana. The banana is, in fact, a seedless fruit, a fruit that seems to be genetically engineered in remote antiquity to be a seedless plant, like a seedless grape or a seedless orange. Bananas exist all over the world, even on remote islands. Bananas are one of the few fruits that you can live completely on, with protein and carbohydrates and vitamins and other minerals. Bananas are the world's tallest grass, but grasses normally reproduce by seeds and by tubers in their roots. The banana, however, is unusual in that the banana is only able to reproduce through its roots and through shoots and tubers, not through the actual fruit itself. Therefore, there's an indication that sometime in remote antiquity, the banana was genetically engineered to be a seedless fruit. Perhaps it was engineered in what we like to call Atlantis.
Caballito chotaleño de mi tierra tropical, corre, corre que a la vuelta es aquel cañaveral. Ahora vengo satisfecho porque a mi negra he besado. Traigo el corazón deshecho y me siento desmayado. Tierra mía, Nicaragua, otra tierra no se iguala, porque sé que no hay chochera con mi tierra la pinolera.
The next country north of Costa Rica is Nicaragua. And Americans don't know Nicaragua very well because of the political upheavals that have been happening there for the last 20 years. But I was very, very interested in some of the unusual megalithic statues that were found on Zapatera Island, which is an island in Lake Nicaragua, a huge inland lake in that country. And on that island have been found dozens of strange megalithic statues carved into various unusual positions and motifs around them. So we journeyed north over the border and went to Lake Nicaragua, and from there we chartered a boat to take us to the remote island of Zapatera. Lake Nicaragua is a huge lake, the size of Puerto Rico. In fact, early Spanish explorers, when they first arrived in Nicaragua, thought that Lake Nicaragua was part of the ocean. And in fact, Lake Nicaragua was probably part of the ocean at one time, and that lake has the only freshwater sharks that are known. And these sharks live in Lake Nicaragua, and at one point, that lake had to be a saltwater lake that was connected to the ocean. But over time, it became a freshwater lake, and the sharks, over time, adapted to the freshwater. We decided to journey out to the Zapatera Island. And as we proceeded from the harbor, we were going through a series of small little islands. In fact, there's 365 of these small islands. And so we were protected. But once we got out into the open water of Lake Nicaragua, the weather suddenly turned bad. We were pelted by rainstorms. Big waves came up on the lake. And we didn't realize just how dangerous this journey was going to be. And in fact, on that very same day, 2 American missionaries were lost on the lake in the storms that proceeded to pelt us and any other boats that were on the lake at the time. It was here on Zapatera Island in Lake Nicaragua that the American archaeologist Ephraim Squire discovered in 1840 over 20 mysterious megalithic statues. These statues are in a convent in the city of Granada on the shores of Lake Nicaragua. Today, these mysterious megalithic statues are unknown to the archaeologist and to the layperson alike. They were found here on a point on the island. This island is also a national park, but it's rarely visited by visitors from any country. This is what was known as the Point of the Figures on the island of Zapatera. This is where Squire found the 26 or more megalithic statues carved out of basalt. Who brought these ancient statues here? What were they for? Were they part of an ancient funerary complex? A giant cemetery for the ancient kings of Nicaragua? Are they perhaps monuments to the ancient seafarers who came on transatlantic voyages in search of the Pacific Ocean? These unusual megalithic stones are found in many places here on Zapatero Island. This one's been split. It in fact appears to be a section of what was perhaps a giant pillar that held up the ceiling of some kind of temple. How old this is and exactly what kind of structure it was a part of is a mystery. This basalt column has been carved with certain kinds of designs and engravings. And basalt is extremely hard rock, quite difficult to carve, making construction of such an edifice all the more mysterious. Nicaragua has had a tremendous history of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tidal waves. Here's some evidence right here with this basalt pillar being split by an earthquake. Probably was many times this size originally, holding up part of a ceiling of a giant building. It too has crumbled, and what's left of the ruins here on Zapatero are just a few rocks and broken pillars like this one. Now we've seen the mysterious sites here on the island of Zapatero where the statues were found. So we'll go directly to the convent in Granada to really view these giant statues. We're inside the San Francisco convent in Granada. And this is where the monolithic basalt statues from the Zapatero Island were all taken. We find here inside this open-air museum over 26 very unusual, even strange megalithic statues, most of them weighing several tons. We have zoomorphic statues, anthropomorphic statues, and anthrozoomorphic statues. Those statues that combine human and animal elements together. This is a typical anthrozoomorphic statue. Appears to be the body of a man. He's clasping his hands at his chest, but his head is like a jaguar, apparently, possibly the totem animal of this chief. This statue is anthrozoomorphic, and in fact appears to be some kind of a warrior whose head is coming out of a crocodile head, possibly the kind of helmet that he wore into warfare. This is an especially interesting statue. It appears to be of a woman with some breasts. She's wearing an unusual head ornament. And down here near the base is a very finely carved cross. Very much thought of as a European symbol, and in fact it's the symbol of the Red Cross today. This basalt stela is actually not a statue, but some kind of a border marker or temple marker, and it has carved into it some kind of serpent, perhaps a sea serpent or giant anaconda. In many ways, I find this very similar to the kind of stelas that we see around Lake Titicaca in Peru. This curious anthropomorphic statue, it's only the top part of a broken statue, is a man here with what appears to be a dinosaur head on top of him. As I look at this, I find it very curious, and I really can't see what other animal except a dinosaur that this might possibly be. Notice here's the man's head and his ear, and here's the dinosaur head with the teeth here and the eye and the snout. It really looks like some kind of dinosaur mask. This piece is apparently one of the pillars that was holding up the temple on Zapatero Island. It's now been moved here to the convent of San Francisco in Granada. You can actually see what's called tenons at the top for other pillar pieces to fit. And this piece is especially unusual because this stone has a dual purpose. One purpose is as a section of a pillar to hold up a temple, but it also has a metallic mold carved into it. And this mold would have been used apparently for making axe heads or even possibly keystone clamps. And we see how molten metals would be poured into these hourglass shapes. We see a channel for the metal to come through and pour a second axe head in hourglass shape. It's clearly been used for some kind of metal manufacturing. This itself is curious because it indicates that one of the things that was going on here on Lake Nicaragua, at Zapatero Island, and on the mainland was some kind of metallurgical industry. Many of these statues here are in an unusual kneeling position known as quizuo. We find this kneeling position, which is thought to be a symbol of respect for authority here in Nicaragua. We find it at statues at Tiwanaku and Lake Titicaca. We find a statue like this on Easter Island. We find them in Egypt and in the Hittite cities, and in fact, all over the world. This large basalt statue is anthropomorphic in that it's only of a man without any apparent animal qualities. Probably weighs several tons, and even though it's been defaced and extremely worn, he appears to be wearing a turban, much as we see at Titicaca and Tiwanaku and, of course, areas of the Middle East. Each one of these monolithic basalt statues represents a piece of the past. If we could only understand the symbols and the meaning of each of these statues, it would help us unravel the mysteries of Nicaragua. One of the interesting things that they did here in Nicaragua was the Birdman Festival.
where natives got up on these long poles with spinning ropes and then spun around the pole like a big maypole Birdman flying festival. This same unusual ritual also takes place in northeast Mexico at the ruins of Tajín. There's many similarities here in Nicaragua with the discovery of the Olmec civilization in Mexico during the 1940s. Both here in Nicaragua and with the Olmecs in Mexico, many of these giant heads and basalt statues were just found buried in swamps and jungles. In both Nicaragua and Costa Rica, there were many fine examples of ceramics, exquisite polychrome pottery done in zoomorphic figurines of crocodiles, jaguars, and anthrozoomorphic animal man figures. Some of the finest ceramics that we find in the world. One of the mysteries of Central America is that the Mayans and the Mixtecs and the Zapotecs were farther north, and it's not really believed that they had much contact with Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Similarly, the Incas and other South American cultures were farther to the south. So we have in Nicaragua and Costa Rica something of a null zone here at the southern part of North America that's not really definitely connected to any of the known civilizations that we're aware of. We've chartered this boat here with Don Ramon, and we're about to head out through the basalt islands that are here along the edge of Lake Nicaragua. Amigo, that's it. All along the edge of Lake Nicaragua near Granada are all of these basalt islands. Today people are building houses on some of these islands. They appear to be artificial, in fact, although it's been thought for many years that they're natural islands. However, on the remote Pacific island of Ponape, there was also an island city like this known as Nan Madol, and it has over 100 artificial islands just like this made out of basalt. As we move by boat through these basalt islands here along Lake Nicaragua, we've discovered something that we think is very important. It looks like some of these islands are in fact artificial and have pyramids on them. In fact, one of the islands appears to be this one straight ahead of us. We're going to land here and investigate what appears to be a giant basalt pyramid. We're landing on the artificial island with the pyramid that we've discovered. Everything about this unusual place seems to be that this is some ancient pyramid on this island. Giant blocks of basalt stacked up. What we see here on this island is rocks piled up. You see certain levels of terracing, very large basalt blocks. It seems incredible to me that they're just here naturally. They appear to have been piled up, but it's difficult to tell. Here on this pyramid island that we found on the edge of Lake Nicaragua are big walls with huge basalt stones. Some of these are definitely weighing several tons. There's no cement or really indication of modern building here, but this is clearly man-made. We don't know how old this is, but someone has put in a lot of effort to build these walls that seem to be part of this pyramid island. Exactly how old this is, whether it's only 50 years old or 5,000, we just don't know.
Our next stop was the Gulf area of Mexico. The area around Villahermosa and Veracruz and Jalapa. This area is the heartland of the mysterious Olmecs. The Olmecs are one of the most baffling of Central America's cultures, and probably the oldest. Archaeologists now trace the Olmecs back to at least 1,300 BC. The Olmecs are known for their colossal heads. These are 20-ton basalt giant heads that are carved from one of the hardest rocks known. The carving's extremely fine. It appears to be machined, and that some kind of power tools were used on these basalt heads. How they were transported and brought to various areas around the Gulf of Mexico and in Mexico is a mystery. And similarly, like the giant stone balls of Costa Rica, it's not really known what the purpose of these giant heads was and what they were doing with them. It's presumed that they were somehow the kings, the chiefs of the Olmecs.
Here we are in Jalapa, Mexico, in the state of Veracruz, near the Gulf Coast. It's here in this museum that some of the finest Olmec statues can be found. The Olmecs are thought to be the mother culture of all of Mesoamerica, but they are the most mysterious of all of Mexico's many civilizations. In the early 1940s, University of California archaeologist Matthew Sterling discovered over 5 colossal Olmec heads made out of granite, the largest weighing over 24 tons. It's a mystery how the Olmecs were able to move these giant heads and other statues over 100 kilometers from the quarry to their pyramid city at La Venta. Archaeologists assume that the Olmecs didn't know about the wheel.
The Olmecs are really a recent discovery to archaeologists. Prior really to 1940, archaeologists and historians did not recognize the Olmecs and that they existed. Certain art that was coming out of Mexico was noticed to be very unusual. And in the 1930s, the Smithsonian Institution and the Museum of the American Indian in New York, they started realizing that some of the artifacts that they were getting were not Mayan and couldn't be ascribed to any of the known cultures in Mexico. Then in 1940, a huge archaeological conference was held in Mexico City. And in that conference, Mexican archaeologists and American archaeologists presented evidence to archaeologists from all over the world that there was an older culture than the Maya. And this culture they called the Olmecs, or the rubber people. And in that conference, they claimed that the Olmecs were the oldest of all the cultures in Mesoamerica, and that the Mayans and the Zapotecs and Mixtecs were all coming ultimately from this older culture, which they then called the Olmecs.
So many questions remain about the Olmecs. Who were they? Were they from Africa, from Egypt, from Atlantis? We know that the Olmecs are over 3,000 years old. But what were they doing here? Why were they carving these giant heads? Why did they move them? What happened to them? These are some of the greatest mysteries of history. This Olmec altar is from around 1200 BC, according to archaeologists. It's also carved out of basalt and shows a man emerging from a cave, possibly the creation cave. We can see here how it was buried and has been almost completely eroded over time.
In my book, The Mystery of the Olmecs, I discuss much of the history and how many of the giant statues were found. In fact, one of the most famous Olmec statues, which was discovered in 1945 at San Lorenzo, which is near to Veracruz, along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, this giant basalt head was completely buried in the ground, as were almost all of these huge heads. And people were walking over it, and a trail happened to just pass over the forehead of this giant buried head. And eventually archaeologists realized that, yeah, this rock that was just exposed on this trail was part of this huge and beautifully carved Olmec head. And of course, like many of the giant Olmec heads, it looks very African.
When we look at the heads, we see that not only are they colossal, weighing many tons, but the facial features seem to not be American Indian, but more African, with the wide nose, the thick lips. They're wearing some kind of leather helmet. They have the stern expressions of warriors. Many Olmec statues have a trademark frown on their face. All of these features puzzle archaeologists, and it's one of the mysteries of the Olmecs. They appear to be Negroes from Africa. Many of them have thick beards and mustaches and appear to be Caucasians from the Eastern Mediterranean. Other Olmecs seem very Oriental and Chinese in their look. Is it possible that thousands of years ago in southern Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras, that this area was some kind of trading zone where ships and seafarers came across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, meeting in Central America? And this early culture is known today as the Olmecs.
With some of these colossal heads, they are intricately carved out of basalt, which is extremely hard stone. And carving these basalt heads, in my mind, would have required some pretty advanced technology and tools, including, I think, power tools. In fact, one of the colossal heads from San Lorenzo was very interesting and unique because it was a 20-ton basalt head, but along parts of the top of the helmet are all these strange pockmarks and circular grooves in it. And in fact, archaeologists have wondered about these strange pockmarks on this head, because it's like after it had been carved as a complete stone head, someone then took what was a power tool and was basically dishing out parts of the head with this power tool in like an effort to deface it. And this has baffled archaeologists for a number of reasons. One, they don't know why someone would try to deface this basalt head with these pockmarks, and they can't figure out how these marks would have been made on the head, because in their mind, the Olmecs were primitive people. They didn't have knowledge of the wheel. Of course, they didn't have power tools. But how they could have bashed out these little circular pockmarks, they can't figure out. And in fact, they have all of the indications of being some kind of a power tool that was dishing out these little circular holes on this basalt head. The Olmecs were also known for cranial deformation. They were, as you know, I sometimes call them cone heads, and like in South America and other areas of the world, like Malta, the Kurds, the Otanists in Egypt, like Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and their children all also had elongated craniums. This was done also apparently in ancient China. It was done on remote Pacific islands like Vanuatu. And the Olmecs are particularly well known for having these deformed cranium. What the purpose of that was, we don't know. Some of these people had crania that was twice the size of our own heads. How were they doing this? One of the ways that apparently they did it was they took a baby's head, and the plates in your head haven't fused yet when you're a small baby, and by binding the head, you're able to elongate the skull and essentially deform it. Some of these people had their heads flattened and like very wide. Others had their heads extremely elongated so that they were narrow and came to a top as a cone head. We don't know why people did this, but it was a practice used throughout the world, and it's quite unusual. Just cranial deformation in itself is in some way evidence for ocean-going travel, trans-Pacific, transatlantic kind of voyagers. The idea that people in Africa and the Middle East and China and remote Pacific islands and in Mexico and South America, even the Chinook Indians, all did this separately and invented it separately doesn't seem right. I mean, this is something that people had to learn culturally and is, to say the least, highly unusual.
Notice here on this Olmec statue, he's wearing a top knot on his head, which may have been the way he wore his hair. We find this curious top knot on the head is also found in the statues of Easter Island.
One of the really strange statues in the museum is the statue that looks very Egyptian.
Notice that he's apparently wearing the false beard that we associate so much with the pharaohs. Other parts of his head, too, seem to be Egyptian-type pharaonic headdress that he's wearing. You know, looking at this sculpture, you might think you were in a museum in Cairo, Egypt. Notice here again that how his hands are on his knees. This is known as the Quizuo position. He's wearing an unusual headdress with the ball in front. It's possible that there was a snake here too. This also would have been very Egyptian. His headdress as well is very Egyptian. It's a very fine and well-made statue. Some Olmec statues are extremely unusual, even abstract in their nature, something you might find in a modern art museum.
One of the interesting things about the Olmecs, too, is that their core area is known as the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is that narrow part of Mexico in the very south. And it's where Mexico is at its narrowest between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And in fact, this is the core area of the Olmecs. And the Olmecs were really on both coasts. They were on the Atlantic coast and on the Pacific coast. So the Olmecs could have had, ultimately, ports on two oceans. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec, too, has a lot in common with today's current Panama Canal. Back in the 1800s, when the Panama Canal was first being conceived, there were three areas in Central America that were being considered to try and create a transit zone between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Panama was, of course, being considered because it had a series of lakes and was a narrow area. Nicaragua was also being considered for this because boats could come from the Atlantic into Lake Nicaragua and they could get very, very close to the Pacific Ocean. However, there was still a narrow but high mountain range that's separating Lake Nicaragua with the Pacific. The third area that was considered was the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico. And what the Mexican government ultimately did was build a railroad between the Atlantic and the Pacific and to bridge this narrow area. But it's kind of curious because the Olmecs themselves had already realized that, yeah, this area was the Tehuantepec Isthmus in Mexico was an area where you could have the ports on the Pacific and ports on the Atlantic, and right in the middle of that area was the early megalithic cities in Mexico, such as Monte Alban and Mitla. And these areas, too, were part of the heartland of the Olmecs and ultimately became Mixtec and Zapotec cities.
And here's another example of the very unusual Olmec art and style. It's very distinct, but the stylization is so unique, almost futuristic. It's thought that the Olmecs were the mother culture of Mesoamerica.
As archaeologists studied the Olmecs, they realized that many of the things that had been previously ascribed to the Mayans having invented had really been invented by the Olmecs before them. And we're talking about the Mayan calendar, the number system, the hieroglyphic system, even the building of early Mayan pyramids, such as the ones at Huashactung, north of Tikal, all of these things really began with the Olmecs. And it was the Mayans who essentially inherited all of this scientific knowledge that ultimately came from the Olmecs.
Year after year, archaeologists discover new things about the Olmecs, pushing them farther back in time and deeper into the heart of Mexico. Only recently, archaeologists have discovered the oldest writing in the Americas, which is Olmec. Also, they've discovered Olmec remains near Mexico City. What caused the collapse of this great early civilization? We may never know the secrets of the Olmecs.
Next, we'll be continuing our adventures in Mexico, going to the Great Pyramid of Cholula in central Mexico, and to the enigmatic pyramids of Teotihuacan and Tula, and then north over the border into Arizona, New Mexico, to look for the lost cities and ancient mysteries of the Southwest.